It's a quiet night, at least on the outside. Inside your mind, it's a little louder. Not frantic, just full. Thoughts moving like waves. Memories, emotions, old conversations that resurface when everything else goes still. Maybe you're lying in bed, wondering if you said too much or not enough. Maybe you're remembering someone you once loved or someone you never had the chance to. Maybe you're just hoping to feel seen, even now, especially now. Whatever you're holding tonight, it belongs here. You belong here. This is a place for soft stories. Stories that don't rush. Stories that whisper instead of shout. So let's go back. Not just to kings and wars and ancient ruins, but to love. To the quiet kind, the complicated kind, the kind that didn't always fit inside the rules. Let's talk about same-sex love in ancient cultures and how it wasn't always erased. In some places, it was celebrated. In others, just accepted. And in many, it simply was. You open your eyes. You're standing beneath a darkening sky in ancient Greece. The air is warm, filled with the scent of pine and distant sea. Around you, people are gathering not for battle, not for politics, but for poetry. Someone reads aloud from Sappho, her voice low, steady, filled with longing. Someone will remember us, she says, even in another time. A woman nearby reaches for another's hand. No one looks away. Because here in this moment, love between women is not a scandal. It's a poem, a friendship deepened into devotion, a bond shaped in moonlight. You sit on a stone bench beside them, listening, letting it be simple. Time shifts. Now you're in a temple courtyard in Mesopotamia. Two young men laugh as they trade bracelets, a soft, private vow. It's not a ceremony, not official, but it's real. And realness here doesn't always need approval. Ancient tablets from this land speak of male love with tenderness. There were kings with lovers, priests with favorites, poems with pronouns that blurred and blended because hearts didn't always match rules. Time shifts again. Now you're in imperial China. A scholar writes verses for another man, hiding them in folded silk. The emperor himself once cut his sleeve rather than wake his sleeping lover, and for centuries after that gesture became a symbol, the passion of the cut sleeve. And no one whispered behind closed doors, because for a time that love was not shame, it was story. If this voice, this remembering, is helping you feel softer inside, you're welcome to like or subscribe, only if it brings you peace. No pressure, just presence. So, where are you tonight, curled beneath a blanket phone, glowing gently in your hand, sitting in the dark, wondering if anyone in history ever felt exactly like you do now? They did. You're not the first, and you won't be the last. And you're not strange for wanting to be understood. You're human. You're here. Breathe in slowly. Let it go. not like a task, but like a sigh you didn't know you needed. Tonight we'll visit quiet places in history, places where love wasn't straightened out, where it slipped through the lines and stayed anyway. Let's begin. Hey guys, tonight we tumble back way back into the sandy heart of ancient Mesopotamia, where clay tablets whisper secrets no one asked to hear, but everyone should. Picture this. The year is somewhere around 2600 BCE. You're squinting under a sun that clearly has something to prove, walking through Uruk's dusty alleyways where merchants shout, goats argue, and the air smells like roasted barley and regret. You're sleep deprived already, so this is going great. But amid all this gritty bustle, a story sits quietly in baked mud, the epic of Gilgamesh. And oh, does it have things to say. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still awake enough, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it where you are? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself following Gilgamesh, not the sanitized textbook version, but the complicated, moody king who rules with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. He's 2/3 God, 1/3 man, which is exactly as exhausting as it sounds. He does all the usual king things, builds cities, slays monsters, angsts about death. But the real heart of his tale, his bond with Enkidu. Enkidu is not your average sidekick. He starts as a wild man, literally raised by animals, until a woman teaches him how to eat bread, wear pants, and think about mortality, as one does. And when he meets Gilgamesh sparks. Maybe metaphoric, maybe not. The two become inseparable. Not bro code inseparable, cosmic inseparable. Gilgamesh describes Enkidu as his companion, his heart, his equal. When Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh unravels like an old linen tunic. He wanders deserts, curses gods, and weeps in clay poetic meter. Historians still argue whether theirs was romantic love or just very intense bromance. But you're sitting there thinking, if this isn't grief, born of deep love, what is? And it's not just them. Buried among Mesopotamian legal codes and temple prayers are hymns to the goddess Inanna, who bends gender like she invented it, because, well, maybe she did. Inanna's cult includes gala priests, often men who adopt feminine dress roles and rituals. They sing laments, conduct ceremonies, and in some texts, engage in sacred sexuality. Imagine showing up to temple and finding the choir's performance includes eyeliner falsetto and a whole lot of divine ambiguity. And then there's the world's oldest known love poem. It doesn't come stamped with a glitter heart sticker, but it was carved into cuneiform, and according to some interpretations, features erotic longing from one man to another. Again, there's debate, but the sheer presence of this question thousands of years ago nestled in brittle clay is kind of amazing. Ancient people weren't just surviving, they were feeling, loving, missing, and yes, sometimes writing emotional poetry that would make your high school journal look positively reserved. Here's a quirky tidbit. Clay tablets were often repurposed. So, it's entirely possible that someone once baked bread on top of a poem about heartbreak. There's poetry in that, too romantic despair and pita forever fused. You walk past scribes, hunched over styluses, priests balancing incense burners, and somewhere a boy writing a name into the mud, just deep enough that maybe, just maybe, it won't wash away with the next rain. You wonder if it was his own name, or someone else's. Someone he wasn't supposed to miss so much. It's hard to separate myth from memory in Mesopotamia. The gods wear their moods on their sleeves, and their worshippers tend to follow suit. But one thing's clear, same-sex affection wasn't foreign here. It wasn't erased. It was etched, sung, whispered, and sometimes cried into the sands. Of course, modern scholars love to tiptoe through these interpretations like they're navigating a minefield of pronouns. Could be metaphor, they mutter. Could be spiritual. But your gut says otherwise, especially when you read how Gilgamesh holds Enkidu's body, how he refuses to bury him until the flies arrive. You don't do that for just a buddy from the gym. So here you are dozing in the heat of an ancient cradle, surrounded by broken pots and whole feelings. You wonder if love, any love, ever really changes. You wonder if two people sitting by a river holding hands against the rules feel the same rush in 2600 BCE as they do today. Probably. You think probably. You step out of the baked clay haze of Sumer and find yourself suddenly beneath taller columns and more elaborate wigs. Welcome to ancient Egypt, where everything is gilded and even your eyeliner gets its own afterlife. The Nile glitters like a lazy snake under the sun, and the papyrus reeds sway whispering gossip about everyone from the high priests to the hippos, including, it seems, the pharaoh and his very close companions. You're wandering through the limestone halls of Saqqara, past murals that have outlived empires, when you pause at a tomb. It's the joint burial of Khnumhotep and Niankhkhnum, two royal manicurists or overseers of the manicurists in the palace of the king. A title both fabulous and oddly specific. Their tomb paintings show them holding hands, nose to nose, in the most intimate Egyptian gesture, short of actually putting eyeliner on each other. Now Egyptologists have debated this for decades. Were they brothers? Were they lovers? Was it a package deal? Historians still argue whether this affection was platonic, symbolic, or something more taboo. But you stare at the carvings, Khnumhotep and Niankhkhnum embracing, dining together, honored together, and you wonder. It doesn't feel like brotherly love. It feels like forever. Egyptian art isn't big on improvisation. If you show up repeatedly next to someone in your tomb, it's not a photobomb. It's eternity. You chose them, or they chose you. Or maybe it was mutual and just didn't require Facebook status updates. Meanwhile, up in the palace, the pharaohs are busy rewriting the rules of beauty politics, and in some cases, gender entirely. Queen Hatshepsut, for example, wears a ceremonial beard to assert her kingship. She's not pretending to be male, she's redefining what kingship looks like. And Akhenaten, with his soft features and elongated body, is sometimes depicted in art that defies both masculine and feminine expectations. When paired with his mysterious co-ruler Smenkhkare, possibly male things get interesting. You duck into a temple where incense clings to your robe and prayers bounce between sandstone walls. Priests chant hymns to gods like Atum and Thoth, while dancers with shaved heads and delicate bracelets move in slow circles. Some temples employed third-gender priestesses, often assigned male at birth, who served deities like Hathor and Isis. They wore women's clothing, performed fertility rites, and occasionally disappeared from official records with suspicious efficiency. You find a bench in the shade of a lotus tree. Someone left a scroll behind, half scorched by sun and time. It's a fragment of a love poem, one man calling another his heart's twin. It's simple but sweet. It makes you smile and squint. Egyptian scribes were not known for good handwriting. You rub your eyes and try to focus on the lesser-known rituals, like crocodile dung contraceptives. Yes, that's real. Egyptians concerned about fertility and the wrath of various gods would use dried crocodile excrement as a vaginal suppository to prevent pregnancy. It's unclear if it worked. It is clear that someone was brave enough to test it. Probably someone desperate not to get caught in the wrong bed. And speaking of beds, Egyptians believed in a richly populated afterlife. So, if you were buried with someone, you weren't just choosing a grave buddy, you were choosing your eternal roommate. Your soul literally hung out with theirs forever. Kind of raises the stakes on commitment, doesn't it? You brush past a statue of Anubis and think about the dead. The silent, well-dressed, perfume-scented dead. What stories are wrapped up in their linen layers? How many same-sex lovers were folded quietly into tombs, their names rubbed out later by nervous dynasties? Because Egypt, despite its gilded confidence, was not immune to revision. Later dynasties, especially after foreign invasions, tightened social scripts. Love got coded. Desire was painted over. You wonder how many wall paintings were altered, how many hieroglyphs chipped away by someone determined to keep the past on a straight and narrow path. Still here you are, thousands of years later, eavesdropping, catching glimpses in gold leaf and limestone. A mural that holds hands just a beat too long. A statue with eyes tilted not toward the gods, but toward someone standing just off-center. A preserved letter asking, "When will I see you again, beloved?" addressed from man to man. In the gift shop of the afterlife, these fragments are all that's left on the discount rack, but you pick them up anyway. You carry them gently, like you might understand more. just by holding them. And that's the quiet power of ancient Egypt. It teaches you that love was not always about gender. Sometimes it was about eternity. Sometimes it was about who you wanted standing next to you when your soul's heart was weighed against a feather. And sometimes, just sometimes, it was about who could do your nails perfectly while keeping your secrets. You float from Egypt's sandstone tombs into a world where marble gleams and sandals slap against polished stone. Welcome to ancient Greece. Here, everything is an ode. Everything is a debate. And yes, even the love lives of philosophers are insufferably complicated. The air tastes like olives and unresolved tension. You wander through the agora and find that everyone has an opinion not just about politics and poetry, but about whom it's perfectly appropriate to fall in love with and why. In Greece, same-sex love isn't hidden in shadows or tiptoed around. It's right out in the open, part of the social script, carved onto pottery, etched into poetry, debated at drinking parties. You're reclining on a cushion at a symposium now, surrounded by slightly tipsy men, quoting Homer between sips of wine. One nudges you and starts reciting from memory the friendship of one soul for another. Sounds romantic. It often was. But let's back up. The Greeks didn't have neat modern categories like gay or straight. Their world of love and desire operated along different axes of age, role, virtue, and public propriety. A common and culturally accepted relationship was between an older man, the Erastes, and a younger boy, the Eromenos, usually a teen, just coming into adulthood. Historians still argue whether these bonds were always erotic or sometimes merely educational, or possibly both with a splash of awkward eye contact. Now you raise an eyebrow because that sounds iffy. And you're not wrong. The context matters. These relationships were framed within mentorship meant to guide the younger boy into adult citizenship and military service. Still, there's no denying the romantic and poetic framing, especially when you stumble across vase paintings of tender embraces or find Sappho's contemporaries writing longing verses from older men to younger boys that make your heart ache or your ethics tingle uncomfortably. But the Greeks also had a thing for abstraction. They elevated same-sex desire, especially between men, into a kind of noble ideal. Think Plato's Symposium, where a whole dinner party turns into a TED Talk about love. Socrates, surrounded by very opinionated philosophers, argues that physical desire is just the beginning, that true love leads the soul upward toward beauty and truth. You're nodding along sleepily until someone spills diluted wine on your sandals. Still, it's not all high-minded speeches. The Greeks also wrote plays full of raunchy jokes, and the line between affection and satire was thinner than a chiton. You overhear Aristophanes quip something about men being split halves of a whole searching endlessly for one another, and for a moment it's charming. Then he makes a joke about flatulence and ruins the mood. But let's not forget the women. while male relationships dominated the records because surprise men wrote most of them. There's Sappho of Lesbos, whose name has echoed through centuries like a secret code. You picture her standing on a sunlit terrace, lyre in hand, composing verses to the girls around her. Her poetry is tender, intimate, and full of longing. Lines like, "Someone will remember us," I say, even in another time, feel eerily prophetic. Historians are still unsure how to categorize Sappho. Was she a schoolmistress, a priestess, a cult leader of love itself? But her surviving work leaves little doubt. She loved women, and she wrote about it with a clarity that makes most modern poems feel like passive-aggressive tweets. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some ancient scholars were so uncomfortable with Sappho's obvious affection for women that they rewrote her poems, changing the gender of the beloved to male. Others insisted she was just really passionate about friendship. You roll your eyes. You know what you read. You sit now in a courtyard in Thebes, watching two young soldiers training together, sweat gleaming on shoulders, sparring with a kind of rhythm that looks suspiciously like dancing. This is the Sacred Band of Thebes, an elite military unit composed entirely of male lovers. The logic, men who love each other will fight harder to protect each other. Imagine trying to win a battle while your boyfriend's throwing spears over your head. You'd better bring your A game. And they did. The Sacred Band was legendary, undefeated for years, until finally overwhelmed by Philip II of Macedon. When he discovered the fallen bodies of the soldiers embracing in death, he reportedly wept. Same-sex love, it turns out, wasn't just poetry. It was a battle cry. Back in Athens, things are more nuanced. Same-sex relationships are common, but come with social boundaries. It's fine if you're the older active partner. It's frowned upon if you're the younger one too long. Gender wasn't as rigid as role and reputation. And love was expected to elevate you, but never embarrass you, unless you were in a comedy play, in which case all bets were off. The sun dips below the Acropolis, and the city quiets just a little. You lie down on warm stone steps, feeling history wrap around you like a toga 2 sizes too big. You think about Plato's ladders of love, of Sappho's ink-stained fingers, of the fallen warriors who died in each other's arms. You wonder how many love stories were never written down, how many glances passed under moonlight, how many names were whispered into tunics before battle. In ancient Greece, love was everywhere, painted on vases, debated in academies, carved into temple walls. It was passionate, philosophical, problematic, and poetic. And somehow, through it all, it still felt deeply human. You blink away the last whispers of Athenian philosophers and find yourself surrounded by an entirely different kind of order, gravel crunching under your sandals, shields clinking in time with your breath, and the sharp metallic scent of discipline. Welcome to Sparta. Here, everything is simpler, harsher, and far less poetic. Even the air feels like it's judging you. If Athens was a city of words and wine, Sparta is all about sweat, silence, and sore muscles. You stand among boys, training in the Agoge, Sparta's infamous military education system. It begins at age 7, ends somewhere around death, and includes a full syllabus of wrestling hunger and strict bedtimes. Also, love. Yes, love. See, Spartans didn't just train soldiers, they built bonds. Strong ones, emotionally charged ones. Ones that modern historians try to pick apart with the finesse of someone opening a walnut, using only their teeth. Because while Sparta doesn't give you a Sappho or a Plato, it gives you a system one, where older warriors, the inspirers, were paired with younger boys, the hearers, in relationships that were both educational and at least sometimes romantic. The purpose to mold courage, discipline, and unity on the battlefield. Think of it like a really intense mentorship program where both parties are expected to weep softly at your funeral. Spartan society believed that emotional ties between soldiers made them fight harder. That's why so many hoplite pairs stood side by side in battle, not just because it was strategic, but because they genuinely couldn't bear the thought of losing each other. Historians still argue whether these bonds were always sexual or if they were spiritual forms of male bonding cranked up to 11. Xenophon, yes, the same guy who marched thousands of soldiers out of Persia, claimed the relationships were more about respect and less about passion. But Plato, who you left in Athens nervously chewing olives, suggested otherwise. He basically said, of course it was romantic. What else would make someone stand between a spear and their partner? And here's a detail you didn't expect. While the relationships in the Agoge were institutionally encouraged, they were also regulated. A love that was too indulgent, distracting. A love that was too aloof, weak. Like everything in Sparta, the balance had to be just right, like seasoning your enemy's defeat with exactly one tear. You walk past a row of young trainees, their heads shaved, their feet calloused. One of them steals a glance at his mentor, who gives a nod so small it could almost be missed. You feel it anyway. You feel the pulse of something unspoken. Respect, yes. Admiration, certainly. And possibly that aching tension of a first love that you can't quite name. Sparta didn't care for sentimentality, but that didn't mean it lacked feeling. In fact, it's the opposite. They believed in action over words. Love wasn't something to write sonnets about, it was something to die for. But not all Spartans loved only men. Women in Sparta were surprisingly independent compared to other Greek city-states. They trained in athletics, owned property, and chose their own husbands, often with a shrug and a smirk. And there are tantalizing hints that same-sex relationships existed among women too, though far less documented. Some inscriptions suggest female companionship that went beyond friendship, though as always, historians get queasy when asked to define beyond. Quirky tidbit time Spartan boys were taught to steal food and not get caught, just to encourage cunning. If they were caught, they were punished not for stealing, but for failing at stealth. Imagine applying that logic to love. Perhaps that's why so many of these relationships left no obvious records. Maybe they were just very good at not being caught. You find a quiet moment in the mess hall. It's not much, some broth, some bread, maybe a grumble from an elder about today's youth. But you listen to the murmurs of shared memories between pairs of warriors. One remembers how his companion saved him in a skirmish. Another laughs about a clumsy sparring match where helmets got stuck together. These aren't grand romantic declarations. They're the kind of small, vivid memories that lodge themselves into your chest long after the battle's over. And what happens when one dies? That's the part no one tells you. There are stories half remembered and rarely written about widowed companions who refused to remarry, who sat by graves long after the war songs ended. In a culture obsessed with bravery, grief still made space for love. It just didn't talk about it much. You lie on the training field, now the stars above as cold as a Spartan's approval. You think about all the boys who passed through this place, sweating through drills, sharing blankets, watching each other become men. How many of them fell in love quietly, fiercely, without a name for it? How many ran toward danger just to protect someone they couldn't bear to lose? Spartan history isn't gentle, but it's honest. And beneath its sharp edges and laconic masks, it holds something soft, a loyalty that doesn't need poetry, a bond built not in words but in wounds, trust, and the silence between spear thrusts. You wake to the scent of salt in the air and music drifting on the breeze. Somewhere a lyre hums gently as waves kiss the rocky shore of the island of Lesbos. The heat here is softer than Sparta's, the olive trees more generous with their shade, and the conversations far more poetic. You're walking through the quiet garden of a woman whose name echoes through millennia like a song hummed just before sleep. Sappho. You don't meet her, not exactly. She lived over 2,500 years ago, but you feel her presence in every rustling fig leaf and every fragment of verse scratched into ancient papyrus. If you're lucky, you catch a line or two that wasn't devoured by time or flames. Sappho's poetry doesn't shout. It sighs. It speaks of soft limbs and trembling hands, of the way one girl's smile can destroy your ability to stand. Her world is deeply personal, her voice unmistakably her own. Her verses are directed toward other women, and though historians still argue whether these relationships were romantic, erotic, ritualistic, or symbolic, you can't read her without feeling something curl quietly in your chest. One fragment goes, "You came and I was crazy for you, and you cooled my mind that burned with longing." Another simply names a woman, and adds, "You set my heart on fire." Of course, later scholars uncomfortable with this overt tenderness did their best to reinterpret her. Some claimed she was just being friendly. Others tried to scrub her of all sexuality, insisting she ran a finishing school for girls. The 19th century was particularly creative, imagining Sappho as a lovesick woman who flung herself off a cliff over a man, as if straightening her was the only way to save her. But you walk the stone paths of Lesbos now, and the truth feels simpler. Sappho loved women, deeply, boldly, sometimes desperately, and she wrote about it with a clarity that would have sent Spartan generals into silent retreat. What's remarkable is not just her affection, it's how she treats it. Not as scandal, but as celebration. She doesn't apologize or defend. She simply observes the way love works, the way a voice can thrill, the way beauty can strike like lightning, the way jealousy tastes like cold metal on your tongue. Sappho wasn't the only one. The island of Lesbos was home to a vibrant female culture where women were educated, musically trained, and part of religious rites devoted to goddesses like Aphrodite. These rites may have involved intimate, emotional, and possibly physical relationships between women. Again, sources are frustratingly vague and modern minds too eager to categorize. Here's a fringe tidbit for you. Some scholars believe that certain gatherings on Lesbos involved sacred poetry contests where women recited verses of longing to each other under moonlight, judged not by applause but by the tears they inspired. Whether true or not, you kind of want it to be. Now imagine lying on the polished stones of a women's sanctuary. It's dusk. The sky is lavender and gold. Around you, girls laugh and hum and weave garlands. One of them presses a flower into your palm. You don't know her name, but your stomach does a somersault anyway. Love in Sappho's world is not something to declare in the marketplace or defend in court. It's something to whisper when the night is quiet and the stars are watching. And in that world, desire between women is just another petal on Aphrodite's altar, beautiful, soft, and fleeting. But Lesbos wasn't immune to outside judgment. Over time, as the Greek world changed, the freedom women had here began to shrink. With the rise of Rome, female desire became something to mock police or erase. By the time Sappho's verses reached medieval monks, they were copied with hesitation or not at all. Some were burned, some just vanished. Historians still argue about how to interpret what remains. Is her poetry autobiography, allegory, performance? And more than that, can we ever really reconstruct an ancient woman's heart when so many male hands have held her voice? You lie back now on a sun-warmed rock near the sea, letting the rhythm of the waves match your breathing. In the distance, a girl's laugh rises sharp and golden. You think about how few voices from the ancient world sound as clear as Sappho's, and fewer still loved as unapologetically. Here, the lines between teacher and lover between friend and muse were allowed to blur. Affection didn't require permission. Desire didn't demand definition. It was simply woven into the daily tapestry of life, like music, like moonlight, like longing. You leave the soft breezes of Lesbos and head west into a world that hums with marble grandeur and unrelenting contradictions. The streets of ancient Rome are busy, boastful, and just a little bit dangerous. The forums echo with arguments, the bathhouses buzz with gossip, and the temples smell faintly of wine sweat and maybe just a pinch of political ambition. Rome isn't subtle. It's a place where love is public, power is everything, and morality is mostly about who's watching. You quickly learn that in Roman society, same-sex relationships weren't so much banned as graded, not by affection, but by status, gender role, and social visibility. It's complicated, messy, and aggressively inconsistent. Perfect bedtime material. So, here's the basic layout Roman men could, and often did, engage in sexual relationships with other men, as long as they followed one golden rule: they had to be the penetrator. If you were the one in charge, the one doing the, well, let's call it directing, then society shrugged it off, especially if your partner was a slave prostitute or someone of lower rank. Love wasn't about gender, it was about dominance. But woe unto the citizen male who took the passive role. That to the Romans meant a loss of manhood, dignity, and probably your seat in the Senate. Historians still argue whether this strict dichotomy reflected real emotional life or was more of a political fiction. Either way, it produced some truly eyebrow-raising contradictions. Take Julius Caesar, for instance, a brilliant general fashion trendsetter and target of some very creative political mudslinging. His enemies famously called him the husband of all women and the wife of all men. Whether this was true or just Rome being Rome, it stuck, and not in a flattering way. Then there's Hadrian, the brooding emperor who loved art architecture, and one young man named Antinous. When Antinous drowned in the Nile, mysteriously and tragically, Hadrian didn't just mourn. He deified him, that's right, turned him into a god, built statues of him all over the empire, founded a city in his name, grieved in public with a rawness that few emperors dared show. You don't build temples for someone unless the love was significant. And Antinous, he appears in hundreds of sculptures, idealized, youthful, a symbol of beauty and loss. His memory lived on not through political conquest, but through devotion. Quiet, enduring, unmistakable devotion. But Roman society had another layer. While elite men played their status games, other relationships blossomed in corners that left fewer records. Slaves, freedmen, soldiers, people without marble busts or biographers lived, loved, and navigated desire in ways we'll never fully recover. Here's a quirky tidbit: graffiti on the walls of Pompeii includes same-sex love notes, insults, and even the ancient equivalent of bathroom stall confessions. One reads, Maritus amat maritum. A husband loves a husband. Another says, simply, I am yours. Crude, maybe. Honest, definitely. You step into a Roman bathhouse now, the steam thick and fragrant, with oil and politics. Naked bodies move past you like fish in a warm current. Here, everything happens behind a sheen of sweat and silence. Some bathhouses had reputation as meeting grounds for love, for sex, for secret glances that lasted just a beat too long. And while no signs were posted, everyone knew. Yet Rome's moral laws didn't always match its behavior. During the Republic, laws were loose, informal. But as the empire aged and Christianity gained traction, things changed. Emperors like Constantius and Theodosius began criminalizing same-sex relations, specifically male-to-male acts, often with the excuse of public decency or divine will. Suddenly, love that had once been displayed on walls became punishable by law. Still, even repression couldn't fully erase what had come before. Romans told stories. They whispered them. They carved them into stone. And like vines in a neglected courtyard, same-sex love kept growing in the gaps. You sit now in the shadow of a column, one hand trailing along the cool marble. You think about Hadrian's grief, about the boyish laughter once echoed in bathhouses, about the shame layered atop desire like too many togas on a hot day. You wonder what it meant to love in a world that measured everything in power. Rome's morality was as fluid as its aqueducts, always adapting, always bending, just not always in your favor. Still, love found a way, through law, through loss, through longing. Even when the temples were closed, even when the poets were silenced. Because love in Rome didn't ask for purity. It asked for loyalty, for memory, and sometimes just enough marble to hold on to someone forever. The marble columns fade and the heavy Roman heat lifts as you find yourself moving eastward into a land rich with incense, swirling silks, and gods who wear their identities like layered garments. Welcome to ancient India, where gender doesn't always come in pairs, and love has far more than two names. You're standing in the courtyard of a temple, its stone steps warm beneath your feet. The air smells of sandalwood and roasted rice, and somewhere in the distance, someone is chanting. You can't tell if it's a prayer or a poem. It might be both. In this world, divine and human desire blur together so seamlessly that sometimes it's hard to know which is which. Ancient Indian texts don't tiptoe around the idea of same-sex love. In fact, they nod to it openly, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with celebration, occasionally with just the right amount of cheeky mythological storytelling. And it all begins, as many things do here, with the gods. Take Shiva and Vishnu, two major deities, both male, both powerful, both capable of changing their form. In one famous tale, Vishnu takes the form of a beautiful woman, Mohini, to distract a group of demons. Shiva, ever the rebel, falls in love with Mohini, even knowing it's Vishnu in disguise. Their union produces a child, and yes, scholars still argue whether this myth is meant to express gender fluidity, divine trickery, or simply the joy of a very flexible pantheon. But it doesn't stop there. Indian mythology is full of stories that resist tidy binaries. Arjuna, the hero of the Mahabharata, spends a year living as a woman Brihanala during exile. He teaches dance lives among women and experiences life from a different lens. Some retellings suggest he even begins to understand love differently, not as a fixed direction, but as a shifting tide. And then there's Shikandi, a warrior, born female, later identifying and living as male, whose gender identity becomes crucial in one of the Mahabharata's biggest battles. The story treats Shikandi's transformation as sacred, purposeful, and powerful, not as a problem to be solved. You walk past a market now where vendors shout and fabrics flash like fish scales. Among them, a group of hijras gathers members of India's third gender community. Their history goes back centuries, possibly longer, and they've been both revered and marginalized through time. In ancient periods, they were temple dancers, spiritual intermediaries, and sometimes even advisors in royal courts. Their role wasn't deviant, it was different, and often divine. Fringe tidbit incoming. Some medieval Indian texts include sexual manuals. Yes, including the famous Kama Sutra that discuss same-sex relations without scandal or shame. In fact, one chapter outlines practices between men, acknowledging them as part of the human experience. The Kama Sutra's primary concern isn't gender, it's technique and pleasure, very on brand. And yet, history is rarely a smooth ride. Over centuries, especially under British colonial rule, these fluid understandings of gender and love began to harden. What had once been spiritual became criminal. Laws imported from England, like Section 377, condemned same-sex acts as unnatural, reshaping Indian society's relationship with its own past. You can still feel the tension in the air, as if a song was paused midway through, and the room never recovered. Historians still debate whether ancient Indian society truly accepted same-sex relationships or simply tolerated them within mythological and sacred boundaries. But the presence is undeniable. From temple carvings to religious hymns to the everyday lives of Hijra communities, love and identity didn't need permission to exist. They simply did. You enter a temple hall, cool and echoing. Carved on the walls are lovers, some male, some female, some neither. They hold each other with a tenderness that makes time slow down. Some figures are dancing, others embracing, a few just resting their foreheads together like they've been doing so for centuries. You sit in a corner and watch the light move across the stone floor, you think of all the people, past and present, who found space here between definitions, who loved not despite who they were, but because of it, who saw the gods not as distant rules, but as reflections. Because in ancient India, love wasn't always a straight line. It was a circle, a dance, a flame that changed shape with every breath. And as you drift toward sleep, the last thing you hear is laughter, soft, shared, belonging to no one and everyone all at once. You step softly away from temple chants and jasmine-scented dusk into the gentle hush of a far-off court where robes rustle like silk clouds, and even the whispers are laced with poetry. Welcome to ancient China, specifically the Han Dynasty, where same-sex love isn't punished or even hidden. It's discussed, documented, immortalized in idioms. You're standing now in the quiet inner chambers of an imperial palace somewhere around 100 BCE. The courtyards are peaceful, guarded by stone lions, with just a hint of judgment in their eyes. Cherry blossoms flutter down, completely ignoring your need for sleep. And somewhere behind a screen, the emperor lounges, not alone. The story that lingers longest in these halls is that of Emperor Ai and his lover Dongxian. Ai was a ruler in his early 20s, and Dongxian was a handsome court official, just a few years younger. The two were inseparable, not just in private, but in public too. Dong's rise through the court was meteoric. Appointments, titles, lavish gifts. He received them all, not because of cunning politics or battlefield heroics, but because Emperor Ai loved him fiercely. The most famous anecdote, the one that launched 1,000 idioms, one afternoon Dongxian falls asleep on the emperor's sleeve. Rather than disturb him, Emperor Ai gently cuts off his own sleeve and slips away. The moment becomes legend. To this day, the phrase "the passion of the cut sleeve" is used in China to refer to same-sex male love. Yes, really, but this wasn't an isolated tale. Long before and after Emperor Ai, Chinese literature, especially during the Han and Tang dynasties, described affectionate and even romantic relationships between men, particularly between nobles, scholars, and courtiers. The love wasn't always political. Often, it was poetic. Poetry, after all, was a kind of second language in China. In the same way Rome used marble, China used metaphor. A man might write, "Your steps echo like falling rain in my courtyard." And everyone knew he wasn't talking about weather or courtyards. Historians still argue whether these relationships were always physical or romantic in the modern sense. But you find scroll after scroll where men describe longing shared beds, tears shed at farewells, and the unbearable sweetness of reunion. One poem from the Tang era describes a male poet who waits all night by the lamp, listening for footsteps that never come. We've all been there, ancient or not. Now not all love was exalted. There were class expectations and social pressures, just as in Greece and Rome, age and status often played a role. Older patrons, younger companions, teacher-student bonds. But the striking difference in China, the absence of moral panic. Same-sex love wasn't something to be condemned. It was simply another thread in the fabric of human emotion. Here's a quirky tidbit. The phrase biting the peach also became a euphemism for male love, originating from a tale involving Duke Ling of Wei and his lover, Mizi Xia. Mizi once bit into a peach, found it sweet, and offered the rest to the Duke. The Duke was so moved by this gesture of love and selflessness that he declared it the ultimate expression of affection. Centuries later, the leftover peach still symbolizes queer intimacy in classical texts. But like all golden ages, the acceptance didn't last forever. As Confucian values took stronger hold, especially in later dynasties, filial duty, marriage, and procreation became the guiding principles of virtue. And as new emperors came and went, some sought to erase or quiet stories of same-sex affection that didn't serve the dynastic image. You can almost hear the scribes muttering, "Cut the peach thing, add more filial piety." Still, the traces remain in idioms, in old paintings tucked into scroll boxes, in verses barely translated, lingering in footnotes of forgotten books. You're resting now beneath the canopy of a plum tree. The blossoms fall in slow spirals, and somewhere nearby, someone is reading aloud. The voice is soft, maybe slightly amused, as it recites a Tang poem that ends with, "If not this life, then the next. Our sleeves shall brush again in spring wind." You wonder who waited with a thudding heart behind palace screens, who stayed up at night composing just one more stanza, who leaned too close at a banquet and got caught on purpose. Because in ancient China, love wasn't always loud, but it was everywhere, in poems, in peaches, and yes, in carefully sliced sleeves. You blink, and the delicate world of plum blossoms slips away. In its place, the quiet tread of sandals over polished wood, the faint clatter of bamboo in a distant garden, and the sharp tang of oiled steel in the air. You've arrived in feudal Japan, a world of precision, silence, and layered rituals, where loyalty and love often walked hand in hand, cloaked beneath the folds of a kimono. It's colder here, not in temperature necessarily, but in feeling. Every movement is measured, every glance considered. You follow the faint scent of charcoal ink through narrow corridors lit by lanterns until you come upon a small writing desk. A samurai kneels there, calligraphy brush in hand. He's writing a letter not to a lord, not to a wife, but to his wakashu. If you're unfamiliar with that word, let's pause a moment. In Tokugawa-era Japan wakashudo, the way of the wakashu was a social and cultural practice involving romantic and often erotic relationships between adult men and adolescent boys. And while today's ethics cringe at the age dynamics, the historical reality was far more complex, embedded in hierarchy, mentorship, and a rigid code of conduct. The boy, the Wakashu, was more than just a passive participant. He held a unique gender position, not quite a child, not yet a full adult man. They shaved the front of their heads but left a lock at the back, wore specific clothing, and were considered desirable by both men and women. And they were often expected to eventually become ninja older lovers and mentors themselves. Samurai culture embraced this practice, particularly in the context of apprenticeship and warfare. A younger warrior might be taken under the wing of a senior trained in swordsmanship, strategy, and affection. The bond wasn't secret. It was seen as a way to teach discipline, devotion, and loyalty. You walk into a dojo now. The wooden floor is slick with polish, and you hear the rhythmic crack of practice swords. Two men, one younger, one older, move together, not in combat, but in something closer to a dance. They trust each other. You can see it in the way their eyes meet between strikes. And later in the garden, they sit side by side in silence, their swords beside them, steam rising from 2 cups of tea. There's no kissing, no declarations, but everything is said. Historians still debate how widespread Wakashudo really was, and whether it reflected deep emotional bonds or a societal structure designed to maintain masculine hierarchy. Was it genuine affection, role-playing, conditioning, or all of the above? It's worth noting that Japanese literature of the time was surprisingly candid. Love stories between samurai and their companions appear in novels, poems, even kabuki plays. These weren't cautionary tales, they were often heroic. Some described lovers dying for each other in battle. Others ended with quiet retirements and letters exchanged over great distances. Here's a quirky tidbit. In one samurai handbook, Hagakure, the author spends several pages outlining the beauty and honor of same-sex love among warriors. But then, as if catching himself, he insists it only works if the younger partner is attractive, intelligent, and not too chatty. Ah, ancient standards. Yet even with its relative normalization, not everyone participated. And as Japan modernized, especially during the Meiji Restoration, the official narrative changed. Western ideals, brought by colonial influence, began reshaping national identity, and with them came imported taboos. Same-sex relationships, once ritualized and even idealized, became less visible. The quiet letters stopped being read aloud. You pause beside a shrine, now a small wooden box holding slips of paper tied to tree branches. Wishes, prayers. Some ask for honor in battle. Some ask for good harvests. One, written in small, careful brush strokes, reads, "Let him return safely, and remember me when the plum trees bloom." You can't help but imagine who wrote it. A young boy left behind. A soldier departing for war. A mentor who gave his sword but not his heart. You sit now beneath a stone lantern as cicadas hum and the night deepens. You think about the bonds forged not just in blood, but in trust, in shared silences, in carefully folded letters left behind. In feudal Japan, love wore armor. It bowed before it spoke. It burned not like wildfire, but like incense, slow, smoky, fragrant, lingering. And even if the world has forgotten its names, the scent still floats in the air. You rise with the cicadas, still echoing in your ears, and now the air thickens warm, fragrant, almost tropical. You've landed in the archipelagos and steamy coastlines of Southeast Asia, where kingdoms rise from the jungle mist and love wears many faces. This is not a single place or empire, but a mosaic, the Khmer Empire's soaring temples, the golden-roofed courts of Siam, the shadow-drenched volcanoes of Java, and the lakeside palaces of ancient Burma. Here, people pray to spirits older than memory, follow kings who claim descent from serpents, and tell stories in woven cloth instead of ink. And among them walk individuals who defy the rigid expectations of male or female. You notice it almost at once, people who don't quite fit into either mold, and no one seems particularly bothered by it. You've entered a part of the world where the concept of gender has never been limited to two. In fact, some societies across Southeast Asia have long recognized a spectrum of identities, and with them, a spectrum of loves. In pre-colonial Thailand, for instance, Kathoi were not merely tolerated. They were part of the fabric of society. These were individuals assigned male at birth, who lived as women or in feminine roles, performers, healers, spirit mediums. Same-sex relationships, particularly between Kathoi and men, were common, if not always publicly discussed. No scarlet letters, just life. You wander through the royal courts of Ayutthaya, where records show that kings kept not only wives and concubines, but male lovers too, sometimes given titles, lands, and their own quarters. The same appears in the traditions of the Bugis people in Sulawesi, Indonesia, who recognize not two, not three, but 5 genders, including Kalalai, Kalabai, and Bisu, the latter being gender-transcendent shamans revered as intermediaries between human and divine. Historians still argue whether these diverse gender categories were widely accepted or reserved for special ceremonial roles, but the evidence remains temple carvings, oral epics, colonial complaints. The colonial complaints are especially vivid. Europeans arriving in the region often wrote home in dismay about the unmanly men and boyish girls they encountered. You imagine them sweating through their waistcoats, clutching their Bibles, while locals just carried on being themselves. In Cambodia, under the towering faces of Angkor Wat, inscriptions mention palace servants and officials whose roles and descriptions suggest fluid gender presentation. The same with Vietnam, where Chinese Confucian influence eventually complicated matters, but folk traditions, especially in rural areas, continued to leave space for same-sex bonds. You can almost see two farmers resting under a tree, fingers brushing, unremarkable to everyone except the historian, squinting at a centuries-old love song. Here's a quirky tidbit in Bali traditional shadow puppet plays wayang kulit, sometimes include cross-dressing or same-sex flirtation as comedic relief. But even in jest, those moments reflect a culture aware of complexity and comfortable enough to laugh with it, not just at it. You find yourself now in a marketplace, the scent of lemongrass and charcoal grilled fish hanging thick in the air. A person selling woven bracelets greets you with a voice that glides between tones, their clothing a blend of masculine cut and feminine drape. No one stares. No one whispers. In this world, presentation is personal, and affection is everyone's business and no one's. And it wasn't all romance or myth. In many Southeast Asian cultures, spiritual practices honored same-gender unions. In pre-Islamic Java, for instance, temple rituals sometimes involved pairs of same-sex devotees, symbolizing unity, balance, and fertility, not sin or scandal. The idea that two men or two women couldn't generate harmony simply didn't exist in many local cosmologies. Then, of course, came the empires from outside. Colonialism swept through this region like a storm. With it came Western legal codes, Victorian morality, and imported shame. What had once been accepted or ritualized suddenly became criminalized. British imposed laws in Malaysia. Singapore and Myanmar made same-sex intimacy illegal, even though local traditions had long coexisted with it. Dutch rule in Indonesia layered its own restrictions, and French colonial rule in Vietnam and Cambodia repressed non-binary gender expression in favor of neatly gendered citizen subjects. You sit now on the worn steps of a ruined temple in Laos vines, creeping up old stone carvings. You think about all the quiet loves that once blossomed here, the boys who ran hand in hand through jungle paths, the girls who shared anklets and secrets, the ones who defied dress codes, not out of rebellion, but out of joy. You wonder how many of them had to fall silent. But you also see how, even today, those stories persist. In whispered tales, in festival dances, in the smiles exchanged between flower vendors who don't quite fit the binary. Southeast Asia never needed permission for fluidity. It just needed space. And even when that space was stolen, something remained. Because here, love never had to explain itself. It just had to arrive quietly, like rain, before monsoon warm, inevitable, and already understood. You awaken in a breeze that smells of cedar smoke and sweetgrass. The air is thinner, now cooler, sharper, tinged with the scent of pine and the open sky. You're not in a palace or a stone temple. You're standing on land older than empires, where rivers speak and mountains remember. This is Turtle Island, North America, before colonization, where more than 500 native nations live, love, and shape their worlds without the need for imported rules about who's allowed to hold hands. You walk through a village ringed by trees and soft drum beats. Elders sit near fires, telling stories with more pauses than punctuation. Children chase each other between hides stretched for drying. And in this place, no one blinks when someone introduces themselves as a two-spirit person. That term, two-spirit, is modern in phrasing, but ancient in essence. It was adopted in 1990 by indigenous people looking to replace colonial words like berdache, a term loaded with misunderstanding and condescension. But the identity itself, it's been around for centuries, maybe longer. In many native nations, two-spirit people occupy a space both between and beyond male and female. They might perform roles traditionally associated with men or women, or neither. They might marry someone of the same biological sex, or someone different. What matters isn't the combination. It's the spirit, the balance. Among the Lakota two-spirit individuals are called Winkte. Among the Navajo, Nadlehai. Among the Ojibwe Ogokwe, a woman man. Each tribe has its own name, its own tradition. And in many of them, two-spirit people were seen as healers, dreamers, bridge walkers, not outcasts, assets. Historians still argue whether every two-spirit person had romantic relationships or whether some were purely spiritual roles. The truth is, it varied, because indigenous cultures are not a monolith, and neither is love. You sit now near a small gathering, watching a person who was assigned male at birth, dressed in beautifully beaded women's clothing, lead a dance with absolute grace. Everyone follows, everyone smiles. There is no mockery, no resistance. This person isn't tolerated. They are central. In many nations, two-spirit people took on essential social roles. They were matchmakers, peacekeepers, story carriers. Some were midwives. Some were warriors. One well-known figure is Wewa, a Zuni two-spirit person from the 1800s, who was respected as a spiritual leader and even met U.S. President Grover Cleveland. Wewa, dressed in women's clothing, performed women's tasks, but was also known for their intellect and skill in diplomacy. You follow a trail now to a quieter place, a clearing. Two small mounds of stones mark the grave of a pair of lovers. No headstones, just offerings, feathers, smooth pebbles, scraps of dyed fabric. The oral tradition here remembers them as two women who built their lodge away from the village. They hunted, they planted, they grew old together. The tribe didn't exile them, it left them be. Quirky tidbit. In some creation stories, gender was not the starting point. In one Mojave tale, the first people tried on different roles, different ways of being, before deciding what fit. It wasn't shameful to shift, it was expected. But as you might guess, this world didn't remain untouched. When European settlers arrived, they brought with them not just muskets and metal, but missionary mandates. They called two-spirit people sinners, perverts, sorcerers, forced them into gendered clothing, punished them for performing traditional roles, sent children to boarding schools to correct them. Much of that erasure was deliberate. Generations grew up without words to describe themselves, or worse, taught that their ancestors' words were evil. The pain of that silence still lingers like smoke on old cedar. And yet, two-spirit people persisted. You sit now at a modern powwow. Drums pound, feet stomp, colors blur in motion. A dancer enters the circle dressed in half men's regalia, half women's. The crowd cheers, not out of novelty, but out of recognition. Something sacred is being honored, something very old. There's a resurgence happening, a reclamation. Indigenous youth are rediscovering what was almost lost. Languages are being revived, ceremonies reshaped. Two-spirit gatherings now happen across North America, safe spaces where laughter rings louder than shame. You lie back in the grass, the stars like scattered embers above you. Somewhere nearby, someone sings a lullaby in Lakota. It doesn't translate easily, but you understand it anyway, because in this place love doesn't need a binary. It just needs a circle. And in that circle, every soul, two-spirit or otherwise, has room to dance. The drumbeat fades, and in its place rises the scent of rosewater and warm stone. You find yourself leaning against a sunlit mosaic wall in the heart of the Islamic Golden Age, where the architecture is precise, the philosophy is profound, and the poetry, well, the poetry can make you fall in love with someone you've never met. You're in Baghdad now, somewhere between the 8th and 10th centuries, when this city wasn't just a capital, it was the capital, a center of science, medicine, mathematics, and art. Scholars debated stars and surgery in candlelit rooms, while poets whispered verses that could melt even the sternest vizier's heart. And love, particularly same-sex love, was not hidden in this world. It was written, carved into walls, sung in gardens, debated over dates and coffee. It's a reality that surprises many modern listeners, shaped, as we are, by more recent cultural norms. But in the Abbasid Caliphate, male poets composed passionate odes to beautiful boys with the same flair, others reserved for battle cries or moonlit horses. You stroll through a garden now where citrus trees shade marble benches. Someone is reading aloud from Abu Nuwas, the scandalous darling of Arabic literature. He wrote of drinking revelry and lovers with curls like vines and lips like wine. His work wasn't subtle, and he didn't seem to care. One verse says plainly, "O you, with curls like scorpions, how your sting brings joy, not pain." Another, I have loved the slender boys of the tavern, not the girls of the harem. Historians still argue whether these poems reflected real relationships or simply literary convention, but the frequency and fervor suggest more than fiction. Even when couched in metaphor, the desire is undeniable. You turn a corner and find a small fountain, water trickling gently into a stone basin. Nearby, a scribe is copying verses onto a scroll. He pauses, sighs, and adds a line of his own, anonymously, of course. Same-sex love may have been whispered and sung, but it was rarely acknowledged in law or theology. Like so many things in history, it existed in the margins, flourishing just outside the reach of authority. And then there were the gulams, young male servants, or attendants, often praised in poetry for their beauty and grace. They appear again and again in literature, reclining in palace gardens, pouring wine, breaking hearts. While their social position was often servile, their presence in verse gave them a kind of mythic weight. They weren't just servants. They were symbols of longing, of temptation, of the kind of beauty that made even caliphs sigh. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some medieval Islamic medical texts describe same-sex desire not as sin, but as temperament. If you were hot and moist in disposition, you might be more prone to loving boys. Don't blame your choices, blame your bodily fluids. But not every voice was celebratory. As Islamic empires grew and absorbed more conservative influences, tolerance gave way to tension. Scholars wrote legal opinions condemning same-sex acts. Poets, who once sang freely, turned to coded metaphors. And by the time the Ottomans rose to power, much of the joy had been forced underground. Yet the poetry survived. In Istanbul, Cairo, Damascus, you find old manuscripts fragile as moth wings that still carry the words. You hear them in the rhythm of recited verse, in the sly jokes of traveling storytellers, in the aching voice of a singer who refuses to change the pronouns of a centuries-old song. You're sitting now in a tiled courtyard, the sky an indigo dome above you. Lanterns flicker softly. Someone is writing a love letter on paper, scented with oud. The words are careful, poetic, meant to last. When I saw you, my soul rose like steam. I had no name for what I felt, so I called it prayer. And you wonder how many such letters were written and never sent. How many verses scribbled on scraps of parchment, folded and tucked into robes, never to be read aloud. How many glances shared in the dark corners of libraries or between the columns of a mosque, fleeting but eternal in memory. In the Islamic Golden Age, same-sex love wasn't broadcast. But it didn't have to be. It lived in poems, in coded metaphors, in cups of wine passed hand to hand. It bloomed in secret gardens and lingered in the air long after the candles were snuffed out. And now, centuries later, The words still shimmer, quietly, persistently, refusing to be erased. From the rose-scented hush of Caliphate Gardens, you drift into the stone-cold quiet of early Christian Europe, where candlelight flickers on altar cloths and devotion is cloaked in robes, incense, and ambiguity. You're standing now in a small chapel where the air is thick with smoke and secrets. The pews creak. The saints on the stained glass windows look down, solemn and unreadable. And in the shadows between pillars, you begin to notice something strange stories, unusual stories, the kind that slipped past the censors because they wore just enough holiness to stay hidden. Welcome to the world of cross-dressing saints and saints of desire, an era where same-sex love didn't vanish. It just put on a habit and learned how to pray. One of the most fascinating patterns in early Christian folklore is the recurrence of women who dressed as men to live in monasteries. The official explanation: piety, sacrifice, the noble desire to escape marriage or temptation. But you can't help but wonder. You meet Saint Eugenia of Rome, who donned men's clothing, fled her noble family, and joined a monastery as Brother Eugenius. She was so convincing, the story goes, that a woman fell in love with her and, when rejected, accused her of inappropriate advances. Eugenia had to reveal her true identity in court to avoid punishment. Historians still argue whether this and similar tales were meant to reinforce chastity or if they quietly reflected stories of women who loved other women. After all, why go to such lengths, risk discovery, and live your entire life in male disguise unless you were escaping more than just marriage? She wasn't the only one. Saint Theodora, Saint Marina, Saint Pelagia, saints whose stories involve cross-dressing, long periods of intimate life among other men, and reactions ranging from confusion to reverence. You imagine them slipping quietly through monastery corridors, praying by candlelight, maybe falling asleep next to a fellow monk, hearts thudding with a kind of devotion not easily explained. Then there are the male saints whose relationships with each other were intense. Take Saints Sergius and Bacchus, Roman soldiers and Christian martyrs. Early accounts describe them as lovers, erastai in the Greek. They were arrested, tortured, and executed together. And some liturgical traditions even included a rite known as adelphopoiesis, literally brother-making, used to unite two men in spiritual partnership. Some scholars say this was a religious friendship, nothing more. Others point to the ritual's uncanny similarities to marriage ceremonies, sharing of vows, prayers for unity, and even the joining of right hands over the gospel. The line between spiritual and romantic devotion becomes softly blurred. You kneel now beside a crumbling, illuminated manuscript. The margin is filled with flowers, vines, and, strangely, two monks holding hands. One wears a halo, the other a shy smile. Was it just decoration, or a confession hidden in gold leaf? Here's a quirky tidbit. Some monastic letters between male clerics are so emotionally intense they've been mistaken for modern love letters. Phrases like, "I long for your embrace more than for the comforts of heaven," or "My soul clings to yours like a lover in winter," raise questions even today. Of course, Christianity didn't officially allow same-sex love, but it had loopholes, lots of them. Celibacy created space two men could live together for life without scandal if neither married. Spiritual friendship was idealized. Emotional intimacy, if dressed in enough theological language, was praised, not punished. You walk through cloisters now, past stone arches and weathered frescoes. In one alcove, two monks are buried side by side. Their shared grave marker reads simply, "They served, they prayed, they were never parted." You imagine them watching storms roll over the hills, tending bees together, arguing gently about psalms. Maybe nothing ever happened. Maybe everything did. But eventually, the church tightened its robes. By the 12th century, canon law began to directly forbid sodomy and same-sex acts influenced by secular rulers and increasingly rigid theology. The quiet tolerance that once let certain kinds of love breathe was replaced with vigilance. Confession manuals included lurid lists of sins against nature, and punishments became severe. Still, some kept writing, some kept loving, and some found ways to slip their devotion between the cracks of doctrine and parchment. You sit now in the back of a cathedral as evening falls. The candles sputter. The air smells like cold stone and beeswax. Somewhere behind the altar, a novice sings a hymn, clear and unadorned. You don't know who he's singing to. A saint, a savior, or someone whose name never made it into the book, but you feel the ache in it, the kind of love that dares to wear robes, hide behind Latin, and still find its way into the margins of history. You rise slowly from the stone pew and follow the winding passageways of history into places even quieter, even more shadowed. This is the world behind the abbey walls, beneath the cloisters, and buried in the pages of books that monks never meant anyone to read too closely. You're in the heart of the medieval manuscript, and if you listen closely, you'll hear something more than just scripture. This time you're not in the great cities or seats of empire. You're in a library, dusty, candlelit, filled with the rustling sound of vellum pages, turned by hands that have copied the same prayers 100 times. These books are heavy with doctrine, but in the margins, that's where things get interesting. You lean closer, and there, next to a Latin hymn, you see it a tiny doodle. Two monks clasping hands, leaning toward one another, robes draping like petals. They're not just characters. They're people drawn in a moment of impulse or tenderness or maybe something they couldn't say aloud. Welcome to the hidden world of monastic desire, where love letters and longing glances are buried in books, carved in wood, or woven into whispered prayers. Monasteries, especially during the Middle Ages, were male-only spaces filled with intense emotional intimacy. Brothers worked, ate, prayed, and often slept in the same buildings for decades. Over time, bonds formed bonds so close they blurred the line between spiritual fellowship and romantic devotion. Historians still argue whether these relationships were sexual or whether they represented a kind of celibate but deeply passionate friendship. But some of the surviving correspondence suggests more. You find a letter from one monk to another. When you are gone from me, it is as if my soul has left my body. The Psalms, taste of ash. Come back to me and let us read the Song of Songs together. The Song of Songs. Now there's a choice. That particular biblical book is all about sensual love. Passionate, lyrical, overflowing with metaphors involving fruit doves and body parts politely veiled by fig leaves. Officially, the church interpreted it as the soul's yearning for God. But in private, many monks used it to express longing for someone much closer to hand. You're now in a scriptorium, a room where scribes labor over sacred texts. One is writing carefully, but you notice something peculiar. In the lower margin, there's a soft cursive note, a single line of poetry, not part of the text. It reads, "His voice was like honey on warm bread, and I feared to taste it. It's not always subtle, and sometimes it wasn't even private." Take John of Fécamp, an 11th century abbot, whose devotional writings include expressions of affection toward God that to modern ears sound deeply intimate, even erotic. Phrases like, "I embrace thee with all the longing of my body," raise eyebrows today. But to medieval mystics, that language was how you proved sincerity. The boundary between spiritual ecstasy and physical longing was not always well defined. Here's a quirky tidbit, some marginalia. Those little images scrawled in the borders of manuscripts feature not only animals playing musical instruments or knights battling snails, but also same-sex couples kissing or men embracing under canopies. These drawings weren't always jokes. They were often anonymous expressions of love or confession. You explore the monastery gardens now, a bench beneath a fig tree, a cloistered walkway where two monks pass brushing shoulders. One pauses just a second too long. You don't hear their words, but you feel the pause stretch like a thread, between them thin taut and humming with everything unsaid. Many monastic communities spoke of spiritual friendship, a bond deeper than mere affection, rooted in shared virtue. But for some, it clearly became more. In some orders, monks would write one another elaborate letters filled with pet names, inside jokes, and poetic references to shared hours in the chapel or by the fire. You lie now on a wooden cot in a stone cell, looking up at the ceiling beams. Outside a bell tolls. You imagine the brother who once lay in this very bed composing a psalm, not to God, but to someone whose robe he knew by heart. The world outside would never know. But here, behind high walls and silent routines, hearts beat loudly. Some monks carried that love with them their whole lives, quietly, painfully, loyally. And you can still read their echoes in a prayer book margin, in a buried letter, in a hymn that doesn't quite sound like it's meant for heaven. In the medieval monastery, love may not have had a name, but it had a place. From the dim candlelight of scriptoria and the hush of cloister gardens, you step now into a flickering chamber where gold leaf catches firelight, where incense burns in bronze, and where the air hums with solemn chants in Greek. This is Byzantium, an empire both ancient and strangely modern, where emperors rule by divine right saints stare out from mosaic walls, and love sometimes hides in plain sight under the weight of ritual. You're sitting quietly in a chapel in Constantinople, sometime around the 10th century. The dome above you is a perfect circle, heaven's eye rendered in glass and stone. Somewhere beneath that gaze, two men stand together. They are clasping hands. A priest stands before them. He reads from a liturgy. There is oil, there is a kiss, and there is no doubt that something profound is happening. This is not a wedding, at least not as we would recognize it, but it is something called adelphopoiesis, often translated as brother-making, a ritual to unite two men in spiritual lifelong partnership. It involved prayers, oaths, a kiss, and the sharing of communion nearly identical in form to the marriage rites of the time. Historians still argue whether adelphopoiesis was meant to sanctify romantic love, or whether it was simply a religious friendship pact. Some see it as a spiritual siblinghood, others as a veiled way to legitimize same-sex unions in a society that lacked language for such things. But as you watch the ceremony unfold, two men pledging to love each other more than all others, promising unity in body and soul, it's hard not to feel the echo of something more than just fraternity. And they weren't alone. Records from Byzantium include dozens of these ceremonies. Some even involve prominent figures, nobles, scholars, men with estates and titles. These weren't whispered arrangements. They were public declarations, witnessed, blessed, celebrated. You pass through a library, next its shelves, lined with Greek manuscripts, some so old the ink has turned green. One contains a prayer from an adelphopoiesis ceremony. It reads, "Grant to these thy servants to love one another as thou didst join in love thy holy martyrs, Sergius and Bacchus." Ah, yes, them again. Sergius and Bacchus, those Roman soldiers you met back in section 13, were venerated in Byzantium, not just as saints, but as icons of love and loyalty. Their images appear often side by side, arm in arm, their story a staple in Eastern Christian devotion. Some icons show them in the embrace typical of married couples surrounded by golden halos and flowers. Of course, as the centuries passed, the church grew more anxious about such closeness. Later, writers tried to reframe their bond as strictly spiritual, their affection as merely brotherly. But the early sources are harder to explain away, especially those that describe the pain of separation, the joy of reunion, and the sorrow of martyrdom suffered together. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some scholars believe the Greek word synethek, used in early records of adelphopoiesis, refers to a kind of contract of living together, a shared household property and life. Not exactly casual. You now walk through the imperial gardens where peacocks call and fig trees twist like questions. You pass by two men seated on a stone bench, one older, one younger. They speak softly. You hear the word Adelphos, brother, but the tone sounds more like beloved. No one interrupts them. No one blinks. It is a scene repeated in 1,000 variations, never quite named, always just understood. But nothing golden lasts forever. By the late Byzantine period, especially as Catholic influence seeped in and Orthodox doctrine hardened, the practice of adelphopoiesis became less frequent. The Church distanced itself from any interpretation that suggested romantic or sexual partnership. What had once been a semi-public ritual slowly faded into obscurity, surviving only in old liturgical books and the margins of saints' lives. Still, the memory lingers. You rest now beneath the great dome of Hagia Sophia, the marble beneath you. Cool the air, filled with echoes. You think of the men who once stood here, hand in hand, oil on their foreheads, promises on their lips. You think of love that adapted, that found a way, not through revolution, but through ritual, through faith, through the delicate threading of desire into the fabric of what was allowed. In Byzantium, love sometimes wore vestments, and even when the world stopped blessing it, the vows remained. You emerge from the incense-laden echoes of Byzantium into the bright clang of armor and the rustle of parchment. This is medieval Europe, the age of knight chivalry and deeply dramatic feelings scrawled into verse. A world where love is duty, longing is virtue, and it is perfectly acceptable to write 30 lines of poetry about how good your friend looks in chainmail. The year is somewhere between the 12th and 14th centuries. You're standing in a great hall, all timber beams and hearth smoke, where troubadours strum lutes and recite poems about damsels in towers and sometimes about each other, because courtly love didn't always follow the straight and narrow. You notice two young knights sitting close the way soldiers do when they've survived something together. One leans in and murmurs something that makes the other blush. The hall moves on as if nothing happened, but you catch the glance, the lingering, the pulse of something unsaid. You're in the world of amicitia, or deep friendship, a concept that medieval Europe prized almost as highly as piety. Letters between men, especially those of noble rank or religious education, overflow with affection. Phrases like, "I love you beyond all others, you are my soul's twin," or "Your absence wounds me as no sword could appear without apology or footnote." Historians still argue whether these expressions were romantic or merely part of a highly emotional friendship culture. And, to be fair, medieval people loved a good swoon, even over their study buddies. But some relationships stretch beyond even that generous emotional vocabulary. Take Richard the Lionheart and Philip II of France. The two kings shared a bed, something not unusual for political allies at the time, but their behavior prompted raised eyebrows even then. Chroniclers described them as having one heart and one soul, while others less delicately implied that their alliance was sealed with more than treaties. You walk now through a scriptorium where a monk copies out tales of trouvères and troubadours, poet knights who sang of noble deeds and noble loves. While many of their verses are directed at unattainable ladies, a surprising number are ambiguous or even explicitly male in focus. The Roman de la Rose, for example, a wildly popular allegorical poem, flirts with gender and desire so freely it might qualify as a medieval fever dream. One lesser-known work, the Lie de Narcisse, flips the story of Narcissus into a meditation on male beauty and mutual male desire. Another poem mourns a lost friend with such aching tenderness that even modern readers pause. And then there's the Order of the Garter, founded in 1348, with oaths of chivalric brotherhood that read suspiciously like vows. Members swore loyalty, protection, secrecy, and frequently addressed each other in the most lavish prose imaginable. Here's a quirky tidbit: some knights would exchange tokens, gloves, locks of hair, or embroidered handkerchiefs, and carry them into battle, not from ladies, but from other men. These weren't always tokens of romance, but they were often tokens of devotion, and sometimes the line blurred so gracefully that no one bothered to clarify. You pause in a garden now, where two squires sit under a cherry tree, polishing armor and arguing over a verse one of them can't quite remember. One says it was written for a princess. The other insists it was clearly meant for a fellow knight. You suspect neither is wrong. There's something else too, an undercurrent in the tales of the Round Table. Lancelot and Galeho, for example. Galeho is often overshadowed by Guinevere, but his role in Lancelot's story is unmistakable. He gives up his own quest for the sake of Lancelot. He pines. He dies with Lancelot's name on his lips. And some versions of the story imply gently but unmistakably that his love is not merely chivalric. In fact, The Knight of the Lion, a 12th century Arthurian tale, features the knight Ivan sharing an intense bond with his companion Gawain, so intense that some scholars now read it as an emotional, possibly romantic partnership. Again, the texts don't label it, but they don't have to. You recline now on a tapestry-draped bench in a candlelit library. A knight-turned-writer has left a note in the margin of his manuscript I dreamt of you in the field and woke with tears. No name, no date, but someone remembered. Someone wrote it down. In medieval Europe, love between men didn't always wear the face of scandal. Sometimes it wore armor, sometimes it wrote poetry, and sometimes it just existed, quietly, unnamed, but not unnoticed. And as you drift off, you imagine two knights riding side by side, the dawn mist curling around them like a promise. No one sings about them, but you remember. The hoofbeats of knights fade into the northern winds as you find yourself somewhere colder, stranger, and altogether wilder. Welcome to the Norse world land of fjords and fire of thunder gods and shape-shifting tricksters, where the line between man and woman was sometimes drawn in snow and promptly stepped over. You're standing near a roaring hearth surrounded by fur-clad warriors whose laughter booms like storm clouds, but whose myths are far more fluid than you'd expect. Here, in Viking Age Scandinavia, strength is prized, but identity is not always as fixed as the sword at a man's hip. And if you're looking for same-sex love, you'll find it tangled up in stories of gods who change shape, men who share beds, and insults sharp enough to start duels. Let's begin with the gods. You know Thor, all muscles and hammers. But tonight you're spending time with Loki, everyone's favorite chaos engine. Trickster, shapeshifter, gender bender extraordinaire. In one famous myth, Loki turns into a mare to distract a stallion during a divine construction project. Not only does he succeed, he gets pregnant and gives birth to an 8-legged horse named Sleipnir. Historians still argue whether this story is comedic symbolic or just Viking humor gone off the rails. But the point remains, Loki isn't bound by gender, or rules, or modesty. Later myths feature him taking female forms again, sometimes for disguise, sometimes for delight. And no one, not even Odin, seems particularly scandalized. You wander through a longhouse now past warriors, drinking mead and sharing tales. You overhear snippets of flighting ritual insult duels, where men attack each other's masculinity with lyrical flair. One of the worst insults, accusing another man of being a seed man, a practitioner of cedar, a kind of magic associated with women. It wasn't the magic that bothered them, it was the idea of a man stepping into a woman's role. But here's the twist. Odin himself practiced Seder. The All-Father, one-eyed and all-seeing, defied gender norms regularly. Some sagas even suggest that this practice was viewed as shameful and powerful. Like wielding fire, you might get burned, but it meant you were close to something sacred. And what of mortal men? Norse sagas don't often describe same-sex relationships with modern clarity, but clues remain. In Njal's saga, one of the most famous Icelandic tales, the character Flosi is accused indirectly of being in an intimate relationship with another man. The insult sparks a chain of violent events. But the anger isn't about morality. It's about honor. The fear wasn't love between men. It was being cast as passive, submissive, mocked. Norse culture had rigid ideas about masculinity, but also a surprisingly nuanced understanding of identity. The line between man and woman wasn't just about biology, it was about role action and magic. You enter a sacred grove now quiet and snow-dusted. A vulva, a female seer, casts bones on the ground. You ask her about love between men or between women. She doesn't flinch. She smiles. There have always been those, she says, who follow the path beside the main road. In the mythology of the Norse queerness often comes wrapped in God stories and metaphor. But the acceptance of gender fluidity, particularly through shape-shifting dreams and magical practice, is undeniable. Here's a quirky tidbit. Viking warriors were sometimes buried in pairs. One grave in Sweden contained two men buried side by side, arms touching. Their weapons were identical, their jewelry mirrored. No wife, no children, just each other. Archaeologists can't say what their relationship was, but they chose to face the afterlife together. You lie now beneath a thatched roof, warm furs piled around you. The fire crackles softly. Outside, the wind sings through the pines like a forgotten lullaby. You imagine Loki's laugh, Sleipnir's hooves, Odin stirring a cauldron of fate. And you remember this in Norse legend. To love differently was not necessarily forbidden. It was dangerous, sacred, often strange, but it was not erased. In this world, love could wear many faces, and sometimes it had 8 legs. You wake now beneath a sky heavy with smoke and ritual, in a world where jaguars dance in the temples and warriors carry obsidian blades. You are in the Aztec Empire, or more precisely, Tenochtitlan, the dazzling heart of it all, where pyramids rise like mountains from the lake bed, and the air smells of maize, blood, and burning copal. The city pulses with life. Merchants shout over piles of cocoa beans. Children splash in canals, and high atop a temple, priests prepare offerings to the gods of sun and war. But if you listen closely, not to the drums or the cries of sacrifice, but to the quieter corners, you'll hear the murmur of something less often told. The intimate bonds between men coded into the rhythms of a warrior society that understood devotion not only in battle, but sometimes in love. You're following now a group of Quapipiltin elite eagle warriors, resplendent in feathered cloaks and golden ornaments. Among them are pairs always together in training, in ritual, in combat. These relationships weren't just strategic, they were emotional, intimate, sometimes romantic. The Aztec military system, much like that of the Spartans or the sacred band of Thebes, relied on tight-knit pairs. Young boys were sent to training schools called Telpochkali, where older warriors served as mentors and sometimes as partners. The bonds were encouraged to be deep, protective, loyal, and in some sources, they were clearly sexual. Historians still argue whether these relationships were institutionalized or quietly condoned, but references exist in colonial era documents, often filtered through the judgmental gaze of Spanish chroniclers. Many accounts describe male-male intimacy as part of warrior culture, especially in early rites of passage bonding before battle or religious devotion. You pause at the edge of a calm pool near a statue of Xochipilli, the flower prince. He is the Aztec god of art, beauty, song, and, as some believe, same-sex love. His statue shows him sitting in ecstasy, covered in psychedelic flowers, his face tilted upward in rapture. Beneath him are carvings of lovers and dream symbols. Some scholars interpret Xochipilli as a protector of queerness, a god who blesses beauty in all forms. Others dismiss this entirely, calling the associations metaphorical. But the imagery remains. The flowers don't lie. Here's a quirky tidbit. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived, they were shocked by the existence of male temple attendants who dressed in feminine clothing, served in spiritual roles, and sometimes engaged in same-sex relationships. The Spaniards immediately outlawed these practices and burned many of the codices that documented them. But not all memory was destroyed. You find a hidden mural deep inside a temple wall, uncovered only recently by archaeologists. It shows two men reclining together, wrapped in a single feathered blanket. One offers the other a cacao drink, an act so intimate in Nahua culture, it was equivalent to a love confession. There are no swords, no priests, just two people sharing warmth in a city that saw love as many-layered. The Aztecs did not divide sexuality into gay or straight. They saw it through the lens of balance, fertility duty, and role. What mattered was not who you loved, but how you carried yourself, how your actions reflected the cosmic order. But then, the order changed. When the Spanish arrived, so did Christian morality. What had once been sacred became sinful. Same-sex relationships, once quietly woven into warrior culture and spiritual life, were condemned, punished, forgotten. Indigenous memory was overwritten with sermons and fire. Still, the stories survived in oral traditions, in old songs. In the careful way some elders say that two warriors once trained together and never chose wives. You sit now on the steps of a ruined pyramid, the sun sinking low behind a line of cypress trees. You can still hear the echoes of drumbeats, the laughter of boys running toward the training fields, the rustle of feathers as a hand gently touches another's shoulder. Love in the Aztec world was more than ritual or reproduction. It was honor, it was beauty, and sometimes it was shared between two warriors who would rather die than be separated. You sit for a long time in the shadow of the ruined pyramid, watching the last light of the sun pull itself across the old stones. But now the sky dims further, not just from nightfall, but from something heavier, smoke, fear, and silence. You are no longer in an empire's center or temple's embrace. You are at the edge of the old world, in the early days of conquest, where memory itself is under siege. This is the age of colonial erasure. The air shifts cooler, now tighter. You move through spaces that feel scraped clean, too clean. Entire cities, languages, and ways of being have been swept away, covered in soil or shame. And among the many things that were erased, the lives, the loves, the truths of queer people burned from record, banned by law, rewritten with foreign ink. You're sitting now in a church courtyard, hastily built over an old sacred site. The stone is recycled gods, chiseled into saints' myths, painted over with scripture. And just outside the walls, someone tells a story in a whisper. It's a tale of two boys who used to sleep in the same hammock. They fished together, farmed together, made a home together. When the priests arrived, they were told this was wrong. One fled, the other stayed. No one says what happened next. You walk through village after village, hearing these echoes. Stories spoken at half volume. A grandfather who never married but kept a carved token from his childhood friend. A woman who wore her brother's clothes and never answered to her baptismal name. A healer who lived alone in the forest and only opened his door to one particular visitor, always after sunset. Colonizers, missionaries, and empire builders imposed rigid binaries: man, woman, right, wrong, husband/wife. Anything in between was demonized. The fluid roles of Southeast Asia, the sacred gender identities of the Americas, the same-sex devotion of African tribes, the rituals of Polynesian cultures, all were labeled deviant, criminal, unnatural. But love doesn't vanish on command. It goes underground. It finds cracks in the walls. You're now in a Caribbean port town, a generation after the first conquests. Sailors pass furtively through alleys, their gazes flickering with something softer than commerce. A freedman leaves a flower on another man's doorstep, knowing he can't stay. A runaway slave in Brazil seeks shelter among indigenous people who still remember how things used to be before papers, before courts, before shame. In colonial New Spain, modern-day Mexico, the Inquisition conducted trials against men accused of sodomy. The records are detailed, cruel, but inside them are glimpses of resistance lovers who refused to name each other, who bore torture without confession. One man simply said, "He is the only one who saw me." Historians still argue whether this was romantic or protective, but the heart recognizes itself. Here's a quirky tidbit. In Peru, a 17th century anonymous painting depicts two men dancing together at a village festival. They are dressed identically, masked, one with a hand pressed to the other's back. For centuries, the painting was assumed to be a joke or parody. Now some see it as a coded testimony, painted truth hidden in plain sight. You walk now along a coast in West Africa, where European traders once built forts and brought laws that criminalized old customs. Among the Yoruba, some still remember pre-colonial stories of male priest couples who served the Orisha together. Among the Igbo elderly women, recall aunties who lived together, farmed together, and kept each other's secrets. The colonial systems tried to flatten these memories, but love does not obey empire. You sit now by a dying campfire on the edge of history. Someone stirs the ashes. You ask about the old ways. They shrug. We don't say those things out loud. They reply. But yes, there were two of them, always together, until the soldiers came. You ask, what happened? They disappeared. But their house is still there. It always is. Because even in the face of forced silence, something remains. A carved name in a tree, a matching pair of rings buried side by side, a love song whose lyrics no longer rhyme but still make someone cry. Colonialism didn't just conquer land. It tried to conquer the right to love differently. But even as temples fell and scrolls burned, even as priests rewrote stories and governors passed laws, people found ways to remember, to touch, to hope. And somewhere under all the rubble, those quiet loves kept breathing. Now you find yourself back in the present, or close enough to touch it. The sun is just beginning to rise over a quiet dig site where archaeologists crouch beside soft earth, their brushes moving like whispers. There are no swords here, no incense, no emperors, just bones, stones and clues. But what they find, that tells stories louder than fire ever could. You're standing beside a shallow grave, two skeletons side by side, arms angled just close enough to suggest a last touch. No weapons, no coins, just a pair of rings buried with care. They were laid to rest together sometime in the early Middle Ages. They are both biologically male. There's no inscription, but the positioning is deliberate, gentle, a decision made. Nearby, someone has found graffiti scratched into a Roman bathhouse wall. It's crude, sure, but unmistakable. A man's name, followed by another man's drawn with a heart. You smile. Love always finds a way to scribble itself somewhere. Across the globe, stories like these emerge. A pair of women buried in a shared tomb in ancient China, marked with symbols typically reserved for husband and wife. A Viking warrior, long believed to be male, turns out to have female DNA and yet was buried with sword shield and honor. Was she a woman warrior, a trans person? A third gender role we no longer have words for. Historians still argue. You walk through a museum now, past glass cases of jewelry combs, carved statues, and letters. One is a tablet from Mesopotamia, etched in cuneiform, translating to, "He is my constant." Another is a fragment of papyrus from Egypt. It reads, "Come back soon. The bed is cold. No gender given. No context needed." These aren't grand declarations. They're small, persistent murmurs, traces of same-sex love buried deep under soil, under silence, under centuries of being rewritten. You pass by a sculpture of Antinous. His marble face still holds that soft sorrow, the kind that doesn't fade even after empires fall. He looks just past you, as though waiting for Hadrian to arrive even now. And further down, you see a bronze mirror from Japan, etched with paired cranes, a symbol of fidelity. The accompanying note mentions it was found in the belongings of a samurai whose closest companion was buried nearby. No wife, no children, just this. You sit for a while in the museum's quietest gallery. The label on the wall simply says personal artifacts, but to you, they feel like more than that. They feel like proof. Here's a quirky tidbit. In the 1970s in southern France, archaeologists unearthed a pair of graves, two young men, arms crossed over each other's chests. At first it was assumed they were brothers, then lovers, then ceremonial twins. No one agrees, but the locals now call them les garçons endormis, the sleeping boys. Sometimes the simplest names are the truest. You walk out into the sunlight where modern cities hum and billboards rise, where laws change and hashtags trend, and people still fall in love awkwardly, beautifully, against all odds. Much has changed. Much hasn't. Because the love you've blurred across this long, slow journey, the glances exchanged in temples, the poems carved in stone, the fingers brushed in passing still exists. It pulses in the quiet corners of every culture. It waits, buried like treasure, not hidden, just waiting for someone to listen. You look up, imagining all those who came before monks and pharaohs, warriors and poets, shape-shifting gods and flower-draped spirits. You think of how many of them were told not to speak, how many loved quietly, how many dared to write something down anyway. And you realize they weren't erased. They were only sleeping, like the lovers in the grave, like the names on the walls, like a song paused, not ended. So now, as we reach the end of this long walk through history, your body starts to soften. Your shoulders ease. Your breath comes slower, deeper, like old silk unfolding. All around you, the ancient voices begin to settle. The Sumerian poets, the Greek philosophers, the Buddhist monks, and Aztec warriors. They step back into the quiet earth, their stories leaving only gentle footprints behind your eyelids. You rest now in a place between times where stone is soft and memory is warm, where love has no name and needs none, where people reached out for each other, not because they were permitted to, but because they were human, because they were alive, and they are still with you. Every shared blanket, every folded letter, every broken rule written in candlelight. It's all still here, all still glowing, dim but steady. The heartbeat of history is not the battle, it's not the crown, it's the small hand taken in secret, the quiet breath in someone else's ear, the promise, remember me. And you do. Let your body sink now. Let the names blend into mist. You've carried their stories long enough for one night. You've seen how love can survive in shadows, in ruins, in margins, and now it can rest with you. The room grows quiet. The world slows down. Let the last thing you hear be the softest truth. You were never the first to feel this way, and you are not alone.